Okay, welcome to my talk today. The title of the talk is Testing Predictions of a Neural Process Model of Visual Attention in Infancy Across Competitive and Non-Competitive Contexts. This is work done collaboratively with Shannon Ross-Sheehy and Brett Ashman. Spatial information plays a key role in the early development of attention by providing an ecologically grounded, continuous dimension along which infants and children can relate objects in the environment. Attention and spatial processing systems develop gradually in early development as indexing of spatial locations and shifts of attention, both overt and covert, are integrated. Evidence of changes in this integration comes from spatial orienting tasks, which have become a benchmark for the study of early attention development. One spatial orienting task has been particularly useful, the infant orienting with attention, or Iowa task, because it examines how different types of spatial events influence covert orienting. The task is shown in the figure here to the right. What you're seeing are the different conditions across the different rows. And basically across these different conditions, the task probes how a pre-cue influences a later attentional shift. So every condition type starts with a fixation cue. Infants then look to the smiley face. That gaze contingent response then prompts the presentation of a pre-cue. You can see the small dot here. In this particular condition, which is a valid condition, you can see that the pre-cue matches the location of a subsequently presented target. So fixation, pre-cue occurs, that occurs simultaneously with an alerting tone. There's then a blank 100 millisecond interval and a target appears. And the task is simply for infants to get their eyes to the target, which they do nice and robustly. And the question is how the pre-cue information influences their overt responding to the target. So put differently, how the covert pre-cue influences their overt attention to the target. In the valid condition, we might expect that the pre-cue actually primes faster looking to the target. We can contrast that with an invalid cue condition. What we could see, it starts off with fixation as before. Then there's an invalid pre-cue, meaning the pre-cue occurs on the opposite side of subsequent target. We might expect that that would impair responding or slow down responding to the target location. In the double condition, we control for the presentation of a cue by presenting cues on both sides. In the tone condition, we only present the alerting tone to look at the impact of the auditory cue, but in the absence of any pre-cueing location information. And then the no cue condition is our control condition, where there's no alerting cue and no visual pre-cue. In a 2015 paper, Shannon Ross-Sheehy and I, along with Sebastian Schneegens, showed the results shown below when infants were presented with this Iowa task. If you look at the figure down below, the left figure shows reaction time data across the different conditions for 5-month-old, 7-month-old, and 10-month-old infants in the different colors. And the conditions are listed along the bottom x-axis. So the double condition, so 2 pre-cues, invalid, pre-cue on the opposite side from the target, no cues, tone only, and then valid pre-cue shown on the right. And what you can see in general is that reaction times, as you might expect, became faster over development. So 5-month-olds are the slowest, followed by 7-month-olds and then 10-month-olds. But the really interesting result was how the reaction times were modulated by condition. And what you can see is that if you look at the 7-month-olds in particular, they showed a really strong modulation of their reaction time by the pre-cue. So they were very slow and invalid and very fast and valid. In fact, they were just as slow and invalid as the 5-month-olds, and they were just as fast and valid as the 10-month-olds. So really interesting data. Shown on the right panel is the accuracy data. And what you can see is that when infants were presented with invalid cues, they made lots of errors, so they actually looked to the wrong side. And you can see, interestingly, that the frequency of errors goes up over development. This is also kind of a surprising finding. So 5-month-olds actually made fewer errors than 7 and 10-month-olds. And you can see errors were also pretty frequent in the double condition. And if you consider the reaction time data together with the accuracy data, you can see that there's a speed accuracy trade-off with older infants. They showed more erroneous shifts of attention in the double and invalid conditions. So in these conditions, for example, the 10-month-olds were relatively fast in the invalid condition relative to the other ages, but that came at the cost of pretty inaccurate responses. Now, our question in this study in 2015 was, what changes in the brain underlie these shifts of attention? And in that paper, we used neural process models, which we thought could be a very useful tool because they can shed light on which types of neural changes might underlie such empirical results. Neural models allow us to implement known neurophysiological constraints, including how different functional neural populations interact to yield looks to the target under different conditions. And critically, connections within and between the model components can be manipulated by the modeler to understand how particular behavior patterns might emerge from the neural system. In addition, we think such models are particularly useful for informing developmental hypotheses about how the neural system changes over time. So in that 2015 paper, we proposed a dynamic field theory of this Iowa task. If you're not familiar with DFT, this approach is about 30 years old. We've had over 200 published papers since 2000. And if you go to our website, dynamicfieldtheory.org, you'll see that there are lots of tools to help you get into dynamic field theory, including software, simulators, tutorials, and case studies, and of course, this wonderful video that I'm recording here. Okay, so in the 2015 paper, we presented a dynamic field model of this Iowa task. The model consisted of a visual input layer shown here at the top, a spatial attention field shown in the middle. That spatial attention field was governed by local excitatory and surround or locally inhibitory or surround inhibition neural interactions. There was also global inhibition to ensure that spatial attention was sort of a winner-take-all or all-or-none type decision field. We also had a fixation node, which if you have let's say the infant has something to look at, that boosts activation at the fovea. There was also a gaze change node, which boosts activation at the periphery. In our model, that was conceptually linked to the auditory alerting cue. And then we had a saccade motor field down here, which was responsible for generating eye movements to locations in the periphery. And finally, a node down here called a reset node, which basically inhibited the other fields and other elements in the architecture while the model was making a saccade, mimicking properties of the saccade motor system. I should note that this model was adapted from 2 prior dynamic field papers. Those are on our website if you're interested in learning more about the history of this architecture, as well as the many things that the architecture can actually do. Okay, here I have a slide just showing you, giving you a flavor for how the model actually works. So this is an example of the neural dynamics in the model in the invalid condition. You'll notice if I flip back and forth between these 2 slides, this is the model with actually realistic developmental noise on the model. So you can see the activation pattern shown in blue is quite wavy. I should also mention the x-axis in these figures is always going to be the spatial location. So retina or the foveal location is going to be at 0. Left on the visual field is going to be to the left and right to the right, obviously. And then the blue line is activation shown along the y-axis, in this case with a peak at the center or at the foveal position. In the next slide, what I wanted to point out was Again, blue is activation, but you can see in this simulation, we've turned down the noise just to simplify and clarify the neural dynamics of the model. Okay, so as I said, this is going to show the model in the invalid condition. So the first thing that happens in the invalid condition is the fixation cue appears. That leads to this visual input to the model centered on the fovea. And that builds a peak of activation in the spatial attention field at the foveal location. And you can see this little inverted triangle here is the fixation node. And as you can see, that's going to go above threshold in the next time steps. You can see the activation in the fovea does not ignite a peak in the saccade motor field, because if you're currently looking at the fovea, you don't need to make an eye movement because you're already at the target you're fixating. So no robust activation in the saccade motor field. I should say robust activation in this framework is what we call the above threshold activity or above zero activity. The way these models work is activation in the field has to go above threshold or above zero in order for neural interactions to kick in. If you know anything about these types of neural models, that's governed by a sigmoidal function, kind of like an on-off step function. So once neurons or neural sites in the field start to go close to the zero threshold, that's what kicks in local excitation and surround inhibition. And then we get this peak structure emerging in the field with local excitation supporting this excitatory interactions in the hotspot of the peak. And you can see stronger inhibition to the left and right of that peak, and that's caused by the laterally inhibitory interactions in the model. Okay, so fixation occurs. We build in a peak in the spatial attention field. A little bit later in the simulation, the invalid cue appears in the periphery. And in this example on the left side, you can see that visual input is sufficient to build a kind of weak peak in the field that's just tipping up above threshold. In this model, once activation goes above threshold, that starts to pass activation to the saccade motor field. And if activation is strong enough, a peak will build in the saccade motor field and ignite a saccade to the target. So you can see a little bit of activation starting to emerge in the saccade motor field. However, the invalid pre-cue is quite short-lived, only 100 milliseconds. And as you can see in the next time slice through the model at time C here, you can see there's a little bit of a peak here on the left, but it wasn't quite sufficient to ignite a saccade motor peak down here. And so the model didn't actually make an eye movement to the invalid cue. And as you can see, the target has appeared over here on the right. And that's starting to build up a nice peak of activation at the target location. Critically in the model, the spatial attention field not only has lateral inhibitory interactions, but it also has global inhibitory interactions. What that means is that this little peak that was starting to emerge here at the invalid position is actually sending some global inhibition across the field, which is impacting the building of this target peak. And that's what slows down the building of the target peak in this particular condition. You can see ultimately the model does build a peak at the target position that then ignites a peak in the saccade motor field, and the model then makes an eye movement to the target. Okay, so I've explained a little bit about how peaks work, how activation grows in the spatial attention field in the presence of the pre-cue, how global inhibitory interactions slow the model down from building a peak at the target location, and how the interactions between the spatial attention field and the saccade motor field actually lead to the formation of a motor command to move the eyes to the target location. Okay, so that's the basics of how the model works. Here are the empirical data on the left two panels in the middle of the slide, and here's the simulated data on the right two panels. And what you can see is overall the model fits the empirical data quite well. So the root mean squared error, which is just a measure of the quantitative fit, was 12.8 milliseconds for the reaction time data. So that means that these reaction time values are on average within 12 milliseconds of the empirically observed reaction times. And in terms of the accuracy data, the root mean squared error was 0.04, meaning the accuracy simulated data is within 4% of the empirical observations. I should mention that the simulator from this paper is available on our GitHub site, so you can see the address there, and in there is a folder labeled, I believe, Spencer Infancy 2022, which is combines this model combined with a model I'll tell you about in a few minutes. Okay. Now, of course, what I've shown you here is that the model fits the empirical observations really well. And of course, the key question then is, why does it fit the empirical observations so well, and what's changing over development to create this nice match between the simulated data and the empirically observed data? So how did we capture development? In this model, we used what we call the spatial precision hypothesis. This is a hypothesis that dates back to work in the early 2000s across multiple papers. And the hypothesis was that the strength of excitation and inhibition increases in early development. Um, uh, how might that occur? This could be a result of an experience-dependent effect. For example, through your exposure to spatial input patterns on the retina, which uh, and that exposure structures spatial maps in cortex, that may strengthen lateral connectivity within those maps. So basically, through the experience of visually exploring the world around you, that starts to tune up spatial maps in cortex for left positions versus right positions. And as you tune up that connectivity pattern related to spatial positions in the world, you see increases in the strength of that connectivity pattern, both so the strength of excitation and the strength of inhibition. So this may be an experience-dependent effect. Similarly, it may also reflect the myelination of cortical populations within these spatial maps related to attention. And actually, recent exciting data looking at myelination has shown how profoundly experience-dependent myelination patterns are in cortex. So these may actually be related stories that I'm telling here. So what we did in the model to implement this spatial precision hypothesis was we literally increased the strength of excitation and inhibition within the different pieces of the architecture. So we increased the strength of local excitation, surround inhibition, and global inhibition in the attention field. Likewise, in the saccade motor field, we did the same thing. We also then increased the strength of connectivity from the attention field to the saccade field, from the saccade field to the reset node, and from the reset node to the attention and saccade fields. So basically turning up the gain on excitation and inhibition throughout the model architecture. And then in addition, we decreased the noise strength in the attention and saccade fields over development. So that's essentially our second developmental hypothesis, that noise is decreasing over development. The right panel here shows just the effect of the increasing strengths of excitation and inhibition on the model for the structure of a foveal peak at 5 months, 7 months, and 10 months. And what you can see is at 7 and 10 months, stronger inhibition to the left and the right of the fovea, and you can see an increase in excitation, particularly at 7 months. Okay, so we turned up the gain on excitation and inhibition, and that's how we were able to stimulate development. So literally, we take a 5-month-old model with lots of noise and weak excitation and inhibition, and then we turn up the gain on excitation and inhibition to create the 7-month-old, and turn up the gain even farther to create the 10-month-old. And all those parameter changes are actually shown in the Iowa simulator that you can find online. Okay, so that was where the 2015 paper left off. One of the things that reviewers asked us to do in that paper was could you use this model to generate any interesting novel predictions? And so we did that in that 2015 paper, simulating the model in what we call the competitive or overlap conditions. So shown here is the same figure you saw before. The only difference is you can see that the fixation stimulus stays on across all of these displays. So what that means is now the model or the infant has to actively release fixation from this sustained visual input. Um, and the typical result in early development is that is, of course, harder to do because you have to actively suppress fixation to shift your eyes to a new location. When we simulated these competitive or overlap conditions in the model, we were able to generate 5 novel predictions. So what you're looking at here are simulations of the 5, 7, and 10-month-old models. The dashed lines are the Iowa conditions I just showed you previously. So these are the actual simulated data from the 2015 paper I've been discussing. And the solid line are simulations of the exact same model with the exact same parameters, now shown in the competitive or overlap conditions. And what you can see is that, first of all, the competitive or overlap conditions slow RTs down across the board. So the solid lines are all above the dashed lines. We can see that the slowing is greater for the 7 and 10-month-old models, so kind of a bigger difference between competitive, which is the solid line, and non-competitive, which is the dashed line across conditions. We also see reaction times are longer in the none condition here, the middle one, with a flattening of reaction times across conditions. That contrasts with the standard Iowa conditions where the slowest RTs were in the invalid condition shown here. If you look at the error data, you can see there's very few errors in the invalid and double conditions across the board for the competitive model, or competitive conditions, I should say. And that means that accuracy should relatively increase with age. So basically, there's a bigger difference in the accuracy for the 10-month-old model relative to the 5-month-old model. Okay, so the model generates these 5 novel predictions. We then, in a recent 2022 paper, tested these predictions with 5-month-olds, 7-month-olds, and 10-month-olds in a within-subject design. Infants completed both non-competitive and competitive conditions with all the Q types. So valid, invalid, double, tone, and none, as I described previously. Each block of trials contained one of every trial type. So competitive versus non-competitive times 5 conditions presented in a random order. And infants completed up to 80 trials over the 10-minute experiments. Okay, here are the data from this new experiment. Shown in the dashed lines are the standard non-competitive conditions. So these are conditions from the original Iowa paper. Solid line are the competitive conditions, which are the new conditions where the fixation stays on. You've got 5-month-olds, 7-month-olds, 10-month-olds across the panels, RTs at the top, and accuracy at the bottom. So if we walk through the predictions, you can see that infants, like as predicted by the model, showed slower reaction times in the competitive conditions. The slowing was greater for the 7 and 10-month-olds, so bigger difference between competitive and non-competitive for the older infants. We found the longest reaction times in the none condition, which is the central condition across the panels. And the model predicted a flattening of RTs across condition. You can see that didn't occur. In fact, there's still quite robust differences across conditions for the 10-month-olds in particular. If we look at the accuracy data, you can see there, as predicted, there were few errors in the invalid and double conditions. And that means that there was a bigger age-dependent decrease or improvement in accuracy for the 7 and 10-month-olds as predicted. So in total, the model fared quite well in terms of the predictions. Now, that said, quantitatively, the original 2015 predictions didn't fit the new data particularly well. The root mean squared error was reasonably high when we fit the data with the old model. So we could say, although the DF model accurately predicted 5 novel effects, the fit of the model was relatively poor. So we asked, can we repair the fit with modest parameter tuning? And what we were particularly after here is, could we repair the fit while holding the developmental changes constant? And we thought this would provide a nice strong test of the spatial precision hypothesis. So here's how we modified the model, kind of step by step. So first thing was in the previous model, the fixation node was not used. And that's critical here as the fixation input varies by condition. So we added the fixation node into the mix, and it received input from the fovea, as you would expect conceptually. With the addition of the fixation node, we now had to retune the balance between the fixation and the gaze change nodes, because basically we want when you have a stimulus that appears at fixation, you want the fixation node to go above threshold and support continued fixation. But when other things occur in the periphery, like an auditory alerting cue comes on, you want the gaze change node to start competing with the fixation node in order to support shifts of attention. So we had to get the balance between those two nodes back in order. Now the model showed better switching between the fixation state and shifts of attention, but the model often had two peaks simultaneously, a fixation peak and a target peak. So we had to turn up the gain on the global inhibition in the attention field to fix this. Importantly, we kept the developmental modulation of global inhibition the same across development. And then the last thing we noticed in the simulations was that the model didn't make as many errors as the infants did. So we increased the cue input strength and the noise strength to try to improve the fit of the model, again, keeping that developmental modulation the same. Okay, so here are the new simulation results. The data in black are the new model results. The data in red are the empirical data. And what you can see is the fit is better than it was before, with an overall root mean squared error for the reaction times of 37 milliseconds. And we got within 7% for accuracy. Now, this is not by any means a perfect fit, but I think it's important to emphasize what we were after. We were trying to improve the fit while holding the developmental hypothesis constant. So we really only gave ourselves access to a couple of parameters to try to improve the fit, and we felt that this degree of fit was actually pretty impressive given the few things we changed in the model. Okay, so in conclusion, the DF model made 5 novel predictions, which were generally supported with a new set of empirical data with infants. The model achieved a good quantitative fit to the new data set while maintaining the integrity of the developmental hypothesis, which we think provides support for this particular account of the development of spatial attention in infancy. We're currently testing a new set of novel predictions using this model by removing the tone cue, so that is work in progress. We're also developing methods to optimize model parameters using TensorFlow instead of doing this work by hand. This will enable us to more rigorously test the spatial precision hypothesis and should improve the quantitative fit to the data. I also want to mention that we used these aspects of spatial attention in other DF models. So you might be interested in checking out this recent paper by Raoul Grieben and colleagues looking at scene memory and spatial inhibition in visual search. More generally, let me note that most accounts of competition effects in the literature emphasize developmental improvements in disengaging. And interestingly, that's been linked to changes in the inputs from frontal eye fields and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex onto posterior attention fields in the brain. Interestingly, our model shows, however, that developmental changes in competition effects can arise from more general changes in excitation and inhibition. So concretely, we didn't actually create developmental improvements in a disengaging mechanism in our model. Instead, we implemented more general changes in excitation inhibition, and that captured effects that look like there's an improvement in disengaging overdevelopment. So this raises an interesting question about, is there really a change in disengaging in the brain, and how is that implemented? One possibility linking these views is that the dynamics captured by the gaze change node might reflect those frontal inputs. So when the system gets that auditory alerting cue and that impacts the gaze change node, maybe that's actually something like a frontal eye field signal to posterior cortical fields that's affecting how spatial attention is allocated. We think these are testable hypotheses. So for example, Aaron Buss and I have a paper where we showed how you can map neural activity in dynamic field models to fMRI and fNIRS measures in development. So in theory, one could potentially directly link our DF model to neural measures in the infant brain. So that would be a nice future advance with this line of work. Okay, I'll like to end there, thanking the team at UEA, again, re-acknowledging my collaborators, Shannon Ross-Sheehy and Brett Eshman on this work, and thank the funding, and thank you for listening. Bye.